These were not the mistakes of careless men. They were the finest treatment their age could offer. A queen waited months for a birth that never came. A king's leg turned black while surgeons argued whether to cut it off. One death ahead was arranged, timed for the morning papers. One more began in freezing water no throne could undo. The wound that would not close. Versailles in the summer of 1715 was not a palace anyone wanted to enter. Louis XIV had ruled France for 72 years, longer than any monarch in European history, and his doctors had cauterized, purged, and bled him through every illness of his reign. This time the pain started in his left leg, a small dark line above the ankle. His physicians called it sciatica and treated the nerve, because gangrene in a reigning king was not a diagnosis anyone wanted to write down first. Cut off from blood the way a garden hose pinched shut at the tap leaves everything past the pinch dry. The tissue below the wound was already dying, while the court chose to wait, a little further and darker every day. By late August, the leg had turned black to the knee, and the smell reached rooms away. Amputation was debated, then delayed, then judged too dangerous for a man of 76. Louis received his final communion, told his 5-year-old heir to avoid the wars he had started, and died on the 1st of September. The surgeons who had waited too long to cut were the same surgeons the court had trusted for decades. The safest choice, caution, was the one that killed him. The queen who wasn't pregnant. Every physician in London believed a queen's missed courses and swelling belly meant only one thing, and in the spring of 1555, they announced it publicly. Mary I, the first woman to rule England in her own right, had gone into what her court called a confinement, the weeks before a royal birth when doctors and midwives waited outside a locked chamber. Her body had stopped bleeding, her stomach had grown, and she reported feeling movement, which her doctors read as the child. Historians still disagree on the cause, whether a tumor on the ovary or the womb, or a case of pseudocyesis, a false pregnancy where the mind convinces the body to mimic one down to the swelling. The body can behave like a radio tuned to a signal that isn't broadcasting, producing every symptom without the thing that should cause them. Weeks passed the expected delivery date, then months. The confinement chamber was quietly opened, the midwives sent home, and no child was ever born. Mary died 3 years later at 42, childless, having spent the most hopeful months of her reign carrying nothing at all. Later reconstructions of her final illness point toward ovarian or uterine cancer as the more likely explanation. Poisoned by his own cure. Ivan IV, the Tsar history remembers as Ivan the Terrible, spent his final years being treated for what court physicians believed was syphilis, using the standard remedy of the age, mercury. Rubbed into the skin, swallowed in tonics, and burned as vapor for him to breathe, mercury was considered the most reliable weapon against the disease, prescribed by doctors across Europe who had no other answer. Mercury does not leave the body easily. It settles into bone and tissue the way sediment settles at the bottom of a jar of water that is never poured out, building up instead of clearing. By the early 1580s, Ivan could barely walk. His joints had swollen, and witnesses described his mind as unstable even by his own violent standard. He collapsed during a game of chess and died on March the 18th, 1584, at 53. For 400 years, historians blamed politics, poison plots, or his own cruelty catching up with him. Then, Soviet scientists opened his tomb and tested his remains. The bones held mercury levels far above what any body should carry. The cure prescribed for his disease had become the disease killing him. 14 doctors, 1 death. Charles II collapsed while being shaved on the morning of February 2nd, 1685, and what followed became one of the most documented deaths in royal history. 14 physicians crowded into his bedchamber at Whitehall Palace, and each one applied the treatments every royal physician of the era trusted, in sequence. They bled him from his arm, then his shoulder, drawing roughly a pint of blood before the first hour had passed. They gave him emetics laced with antimony to force vomiting, purgatives to empty his bowels, and enemas meant to scour the intestines clean. Purging was believed to flush corrupted humors from the body. An imbalanced doctors trusted the way we trust rebalancing a scale, treating illness as too much of one substance and not enough of another. Over 4 days they bled him repeatedly and blistered his scalp, convinced each treatment was pulling the sickness out. Charles apologized to the men in the room for taking, in his own words, an unconscionable time to die. He died on February the 6th, at 54. The treatments meant to save him had drained a dying man of the blood he needed to survive. Within 2 generations, physicians in London began questioning whether bleeding a patient helped or harmed, a debate medicine would not fully settle for another 200 years. The Tsar who saved strangers. The Gulf of Finland was already freezing when Peter I waded in that November of 1724, working through the night alongside his men to help pull sailors from a grounded boat near Lachta. He was 52, had ruled Russia for over 4 decades, and had already been suffering for months from a painful blockage that made urinating difficult, a condition his doctors treated with rest and warm baths rather than surgery. The blockage worked like a clogged drain, backing pressure up into organs that were never built to hold it, and each week without relief made the damage worse. The night in the icy water pushed his body past what it could recover from. Fever set in. Then infection spread through tissue the blockage had already weakened, worsening by the day despite doctors' constant attention. Peter spent his final days unable to speak clearly enough to name his successor, reportedly writing only 2 legible words before the pen slipped from his hand. He died on February the 8th, 1725, at 52, having built St. Petersburg, modernized the Russian state, and drowned no one that winter night except the emperor, who insisted on being one of the men in the water. The blood that wouldn't clot. In 1904, Tsarevich Alexei Romanov was born heir to the Russian throne, carrying a condition his parents did not understand until his first internal bleeding episode nearly killed him as an infant. Alexei had hemophilia, a disorder where blood is missing one of the proteins needed to seal a wound, the way glue missing a single ingredient stays thin and never sets no matter how long you wait for it to dry. A simple bruise could swell for days. A fall down a staircase, or even the pressure of rough play, could cause internal bleeding that left him in pain for weeks at a time. Empress Alexandra, desperate after doctors offered no cure, turned to Grigory Rasputin, a wandering mystic who calmed the boy during his worst crises, whether through suggestion, timing, or plain coincidence, remains disputed. Rasputin's influence over the empress, built on his hold over her dying son, helped destabilize the monarchy's public standing in its final years. Alexei never reached adulthood. In July of 1918, Bolshevik soldiers executed the entire imperial family in a basement in Yekaterinburg. He was 13. His hemophilia, hidden from the Russian public for over a decade, was rendered irrelevant in a single night by a firing squad. The arsenic in his hair. Doctors on the remote island of St. Helena believed Napoleon Bonaparte's decline in his last years on the island came from a diseased liver, the same illness they had seen kill other Europeans stationed in tropical climates. He complained of stomach pain, nausea, and swelling for years before his death on May 5, 1821, at 51. An autopsy performed by his own physician found a large stomach ulcer, which the doctors present recorded as the cause of death and closed the case. Whether that ulcer was cancer or something else entirely is still an open question. Arsenic works on the body the way rust works on a pipe in damp ground. A little more damage with every fresh exposure until the pipe gives. Researchers later testing his preserved hair found levels far above normal. And because hair grows steadily and holds on to whatever passes through the bloodstream, the way rings mark a tree trunk year by year, the exposures could be roughly dated. Some historians argue the arsenic came from wallpaper dye and medicine common at the time, absorbed by accident. Others maintain the pattern is too consistent with deliberate poisoning to dismiss. No consensus has settled the debate, and the man who once commanded most of Europe died on a small island still arguing, in the historical record, over what actually killed him. Too many losses to count. Queen Anne's coffin needed to be built nearly square, wider than it was long, because by the time she died in 1714, her body had grown too large for a standard shape to hold. She had been pregnant at least 17 times across her marriage, and not one of those pregnancies produced a child who survived to adulthood. Her son William, the one who lived longest, died at 11. Each loss left her body weaker and her joints in worse pain from gout, a condition where sharp crystals build up inside a joint the way sugar crystallizes and hardens at the bottom of a glass left standing too long, swelling the area and making every step agony. By her final years, Anne could barely walk and had to be carried to her own royal duties in a chair. Her physicians blamed her weight and her grief in equal measure, treating both with rest, purges, and little else. She died on August 1, 1714, at 49, having outlived every child she bore and having ruled a kingdom that would pass, by law, to a German cousin she had never met because no direct heir remained. Her body, like her reign, had simply run out of survivors. Timed for the morning papers. In January of 1936, King George V lay dying at Sandringham House from chronic lung disease, slipping in and out of consciousness as his family and doctors kept watch. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, later wrote in his own private notes that he judged the king's final hours unlikely to end before the morning papers went to print, and that a death announced too late for the most prestigious paper to carry the news first would be undesirable. Dawson injected George with a dose of morphine and cocaine, sedatives that slow breathing the way turning a dial down past its lowest marked setting stops the sound rather than softening it. The king died shortly before midnight on January the 20th, at 70, in time for the announcement to reach the next morning's papers exactly as Dawson had planned. Dawson's notes remained sealed for nearly 50 years, found only after his own death among the papers he had left behind. When historians finally read them, the account confirmed what some in the royal household had long suspected, that a doctor had timed a king's death to suit a newspaper's schedule. Cases like this, once they became public, fed directly into the debate that still shapes end-of-life medicine today, over who gets to decide when a dying patient's death happens, and why. Which of these deaths surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe for more forgotten medical history.